If you've played or watched a game of UUbers, you've almost certainly seen at least one of these three guys on one or maybe both teams. Magearna, Zacian, and Cyclizar right now are easily the three most used Pokemon of UUbers. And they all fulfill different roles, which makes them pretty dominant in each way. Now, first of all, clearly they're all good. Here, if we look at the viability chart, my kind squared, who's the tier leader, we have Magearna on top, closely followed by Palkia Origin, Zacian, Palafin, and then Cyclizar thereafter. So tier leader considers them not just top 3 in usage, but also top 5, all 3 of them, by viability. So we can see here in the first month of UUbers, which was October, Cyclizars just barely have Palkia Origin, and the other two are pretty far ahead of Cyclizar, and almost half of teams have both of them. So what makes them so common, first of all, is that they're all very splashable. No single one of these Pokemon, requires something else to function. For example, Ursaluna, the regular one, requires a Trick Room Setter, otherwise it's just not going to work. Chi-Yu can function without Sun, but you probably need Sun. Walking Wake has to have Sun to function. But these guys can be thrown on any team style. Rain, Sun, Balance, even Stall will feature these guys. Even Zacian, as like a kind of a sweeper set to come and clean up the game. But what makes them each individually good is that Zacian basically is a sweeper or breaker. Magearna is a jack of all trades, can run a million different sets. And Cyclizar has its one utility role and role compression that makes it just really good at doing that. And in November, we see Zacian drop off a little bit, which I think is interesting even though Dondozo, its main counter, actually rose out of the tier. Cyclizar rises up a lot. I think people realize how good Shedtail is. And Magearna stays on top because there's almost always a reason you can use Magearna on any team. So let's talk about Magearna first. Basically the number one Pokemon of UUbers, as long as you're not counting Arceus, in all of its forms. So what makes Magearna so good is that it has so many different sets it can run. I think the three main ones, though, are Trick Room Setter, Double Dance, and General Utility. Trick Room Setter, you're always going to see this guy in Trick Room, because it's pretty much impossible to stop Magearna from putting up Trick Room. It can be so bulky on the physical or special end that can, for example, live Houndstone's Last Respects from almost max power if it's not banded, and Landorus Incarnate's Earth's power, even, does not break it if you're fully special and calm. And then, to complement this bulk and ability to set Trick Room, is it can pivot with Steel Beam, Volt, or Eject Pack Floor Cannon even. I've seen all of them. Steel Beam, it can just knock itself out and do a huge chunk while doing so. Volt Switch if it wants to stay around for longer. And Eject Pack Floor Cannons, same idea as Steel Beam, but instead of damaging yourself, you're using up your item to do that. And of course, its typing is also great. Let's get that out of the way too. And with Terra Water, this thing is impossible to quickly take out. And I've also put up Terra Flying, but really, I'd say 90% of the time, you're going to see Terra Water on Magearna. It just really complements the Fairy Steel typing, and can make things into a bit of a guessing game. Also resisting Palafin and Fire Blast from Chi-Yu is really nice. So another common set on Magearna is Double Dance. It's going to be running something like Iron Defense or Shift Gear, and then always Calm Mind, Stored Power, and Draining Kiss. This thing is really hard to stop if you let it get going, kind of in the same way that Spothra picks up momentum really quickly. Because Stored Power, of course, you can't ignore with unaware Pokemon like Clefable. And then Draining Kiss makes Magearna very hard to take out, because if it's set up with Iron Defense and Calm Mind, it's not going to be taking a lot of damage, and Draining Kiss is going to heal off all of the weaker hits that it takes. Double Dance is a really strong win con if you could set it up, but it can also be a little predictable. But it's so strong that even if you know it's coming, you have to make some good plays just to stop this thing. However, I'd say the most common set right now in Magearna is just doing general utility. It gets a lot of great utility moves, like Spikes was a big gain for it this generation. Encore lets it mess with setup sweepers, of which there are many in the gen. Well, yeah, the gen, but also UUbers specifically. And Thunderwave is pretty much always going to be good, especially in a tier without many ground types to switch in. It can also run screens and a few other cool options like Imprison if you're doing specific techs. And the thing is, utility is going to be investing mostly in bulk, but it stabs things like Floor Cannon always hit hard. Especially coming off that 130 special attack, you don't have to invest to take chunks out of things that don't resist it. And these are just 3 sets I've seen the most out of any. It also has things like Assault Vest to make it uber bulky on the special side while also throwing off strong hits. Choice Specs can make it pretty threatening. Yeah, Magearna, I'd say, is the ultimate glue Pokemon of the tier. Because if you have a hole in your team that needs to be patched, there's a pretty good chance that Magearna will patch that hole pretty well. So next we have Zacian. This thing is the benchmark of speed in UUbers. Although technically there are a couple things that outspeed it, like Dragapult. Dragapult's pretty uncommon, and Zacian is the de facto fastest Pokemon in the tier. And it uses this to great effect. So of course Intrepid Sword, on its first switch in, makes it incredibly threatening. With something like Choice Band and Intrepid Sword, it's almost impossible to switch into. Even if you have combinations of like a Poison type and Quagsire, there's still a good chance you can get just O-Code or 2-hit if you don't make the prediction correctly. And that's if you think it's banned. Because if you switch, you could get hit by Swords Dance. And Swords Dance is probably one of the best sweepers of the tier because it's so fast already. This thing gets one Swords Dance on top of Intrepid Sword, and you may very well lose the game on the spot, especially with its common terror types in Fire and Ground, which let it hit things like Magearna and Arceus Poison, which it otherwise can struggle with. I've also seen Scarf on Zacian, which makes it outspeed even things that are boosted, such as Walking Wake, the usually Scarfed Chi-Yu, anything that has one Dragon Dance up. Zacian with a Scarf can still come in on these guys and take them out. Scarf is also good against Webs teams who are expecting to outspeed Zacian, but then meet an unfortunate fate when in fact Play Rough hits them instead. And Zacian, I think, has improved because of Dondozo and Giratina, Gliscor. A lot of these defensive answers rose out of UUbers because of the usage they received in normal Ubers. And so a more offensive meta is better for Zacian, because it just makes it harder to check this thing. And finally, I want to talk about Cyclizar. I put its Terra types up there, but it doesn't really ever Terra. It doesn't need to. And this thing is so good because of 2 reasons. Shed Tail and 50% Shed Tail and 50% the other things, it compresses into one Pokemon. So you always see Shed Tail and Cyclizar, and then it will often have Knockoff, Rapid Spin, Taunt, or U-Turn, and occasionally something like Draco Meteor or Overheat to hit certain things. But having all of that compression is really good for Cyclizar. There's not a lot of Pokemon that are clicking a knockoff in this tier, so the knockoff is pretty valuable on it. It's one of the only hazard removal options in Rapid Spin, and it's really good against anything that's a little too passive for its own good, with Shed Tail. Importantly, it also has regen, so it can Shed Tail a lot throughout the game. I mean, that's the reason Shed Tail got banned from regular tiers of play. It's just too good on this Pokemon, and Ortworm was around too. It also has one good stat, really, in its speed. 121 is exactly 1 point faster than Arceus, who is one of, well, if you count them all together, is the most prevalent Pokemon in the tier. And so always getting off a Shed Tail on Arceus is really valuable, because it just makes Shed Tail nearly unstoppable. I've saw some people run Scarf when they really, really want to get off Shed Tail, because, I mean, that's half the reason you bring this Pokemon, right? Probably more than half. Cyclizar is Shed Tail, with a few other nice moves to go along with it. And Shed Tail is so good because, in this offensive meta we have, being able to get a free turn of setup, perhaps, or at least getting the safe switch in at least, is so threatening. You have things like Espathra, and Arceus Fire, and Zacian, and Magearna, which are all demonic setup threats, and Cyclizar being able to bring them in safely against pretty much any hit is really important. That's what makes it so good, and it's the reason you have to plan for it in team building. And so all of these Pokemon are very threatening together. I think they do kind of have a sort of triangle balance. I'm not gonna, it's not grass, fire, water. It's not that clear, but I do think they do have an interesting interplay in that Zacian is one of the only things that outspeeds and kills Cyclizar cleanly, whereas Cyclizar is good against Magearna because it pretty much always Shed Tails against it, and Magearna is good against Zacian because unless you Terra, which is a pretty big committal, Magearna is a really good check against Zacian, because things like close combat aren't going to be doing enough damage. But similarly, Zacian can break through Magearna, of course, if it chooses to Terra. If it gets a Swords Dance, Terra Fire, Terra Ground, that will knock out Magearna all the time. Magearna is also really good for Cyclizar, because Cyclizar forces a lot of switches. Magearna's spikes are really good for that, and because there's not many hazard removal options, the spikes can really rack up really quickly in UUbers. Because when you Shed Tail into something, you demand an answer to that threat, unless you just want to set up and get swept instantly. So you force a sweep, you can probably chunk it, and it can come back to Cyclizar later. It forces a lot of progress. And then of course Cyclizar also supports Zacian, that is just a really good receiver of Shed Tail. So I think that's just my general conception of the big three, as I call them, of UUbers. Not counting Arceus because that's like 10 different Pokemon to really honestly talk about. Let me know what you think. Hope you found this informative or at least interesting, and thanks for watching. See ya.